this video, we're going to do a little bit of practice with the Banks knowledge that we got in the last lecture about T accounts and balance sheets and all that good stuff. So at this point, the first question says, show how a $1,000 checkable deposit, and that's just a demand deposit, right? That's a checking account deposit. How it would be listed in a T account if the bank is under a 10% required reserve and it loans the rest of the deposit out. Okay, well that's not too bad here. So we know the first thing is we've got to say demand deposit, and that's the liability. That's how much the bank owes, and that would be $1,000, $1,000, right? And then over here on the assets side, this bank is under a 10% required reserve. So they have to keep required reserve. 10% of 1,000 is 100. They have to keep $100 in the bank, but they loan the rest out. So we've got loans, and that's 900. And that's all there is. Okay. Now problem 2, the Bank of Ladue has the following balance sheet. Okay, sure. They've got this stuff, and they got some of this stuff, and they got equity that balances it out. Looks good. Now, it says first, what is the reserve requirement? So we can give this answer as a percent or as a decimal, but we have to remember that it's the required reserves number compared to not all the liabilities. No, don't do that. That's a common mistake. Just to the demand deposits. So it's the ratio of $10,000 to $50,000. And so that would be 0.2, or we could say 20%, because it's that 10,000 divided by that 50,000. It's that ratio. Okay, now it says assume that Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Ladue Bank. How much do Ladue's total reserves change? Well, that isn't really, it's not a trick question. It's he withdraws $5,000, and so this amount becomes $45,000. Okay, and then over here the total reserves, right? The total, they were 15, so now they're just 10. So it changes by 5,000. Not tricky here at all. Okay. By how much do the excess reserves change? Now this is where people get tripped up. They get tricky because they'll think, oh, well, the bank has 5,000 in excess reserves, so they just take it right out of that, right? No, they don't. Go back for a second. 20%. Well, when he withdraws the money on the liabilities side, then now the bank doesn't have to hold as much in the required reserve side. Now we know that the total amount at the end is going to be 10. We know that at the end they're going to say, well, they're going to take $5,000 out of this $15,000, but they don't have to hold as much in required reserves anymore. Think about it. 20% of $45,000 is not that $10,000 anymore. In fact, 20% of $45,000 is $9,000. So this becomes $9,000. Now, the other portion of his $5,000 that we gave him, some of it came from the excess reserves, and that goes down to $1,000, because we know at the end of this, that's got to equal 10K, because that's where they got the money from. So the amount that the excess reserves changed, they went from $5,000 to $1,000, so it's a $4,000 change. Now the second reason for why this happens, so sometimes students go, what? They go, how'd you know that 10 became 9? Well, remember, it's 20% of the 45,000, and so that went down 1,000. We had to give him a total of 5, so the other 4 had to have come from excess reserves. That explanation just does not work for some people. So let me give you another explanation, and it's not as maybe technically correct, but it'll always give you the right answer. $5,000 in cash. That's how much his withdrawal was, right? What's 20% of that? Well, 20% is $1,000. So that is how much the required reserves are going to change by. And the remainder, $4,000, is how much the excess reserves are going to change by. So because 20% of the money has to come out of the required reserves, it's $1,000 out of that, and so $4,000 is the change in the excess reserves. It gives you the same answer is another way to think about it. Now, the last question, B3. What's the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of money? Now, students sometimes forget about this, right? You've got M0, which is just cash. So we'll say cash is M0. That's a little small. So let me actually draw this picture somewhere else. I'm going to draw it on the previous page. So you've got M0, and that's cash, right? And then, in addition, you've got another measure of the money supply called M1. Now, M1 includes cash, and it includes demand deposits. Demand deposits. So if Luis takes money from the demand deposits and moves it into cash, the total amount of M1 doesn't change. Think about it this way. If instead we had a different problem and we said the demand deposits are $2,000 and cash is $2,000, and Luis walked in and said, I would like $50 to go from demand deposit to cash. I want $50 out of the ATM. Well, this number, and by the way, we add these together, that gives you M1. This number, demand deposits, becomes $1,950. This cash becomes $2,050. The total is still the same. The total's still the same. So for our correct answer here, how much does M1, up here, what's the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure? None, no change, because it stays in M1. Now, if it had said instead M0, well, M0 is $5,000 bigger, but M1 stayed the same. Okay, now let's take a look at question 3. Similar question, says the Bank of Clayton, and we have a bunch of different assets and liabilities. Based on their balance sheet, what's the reserve ratio? Now, I'm going to change this in the next year because it's the same number. It's 2,000 to 10,000. So 2K over 10K is 0.2 or 20%. So it's a 20% reserve ratio, just like the other problem. Suppose an individual deposits $5,000 in cash into a checking account, demand deposit account. What's the immediate effect of the deposit on M1? Again, there's no change because it's just the same as the other problem. Now we just moved it the other way. Now, if we had asked what's the change in M0, well, M0, $5,000 went down, right? Because we took it away. It's no more cash. Number 2, what's the immediate effect on required reserves? Well, 20%, right? 20% of the 5,000 has to be held as required reserves, so it would increase by 1,000. And then by how much of the cash deposit could the bank loan out? Well, they could loan out 80% of that 5,000, so we would say $4,000. $4,000. Okay. Now, here's a question for us. Assume the 1,000 is deposited into the bank for each of the following. Calculate the amount shown. Okay, so for each of these, it's just going to be required reserves is what's this percentage of that? So that's $10, and then they could loan out $990, and then 5% is $50, so they loan out $950. 10% is $100, so they could loan out $900, and then $250 and $750. And 500 and 500. Okay, so hopefully this helps you understand a little bit of some of the bank balance sheet questions that you're liable to see on a test, and I'll see you next time.